This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the free online strategy game happening in a modern global warfare. Set in the early 21st century, Conflict of Nations lets you take full control of a nation to find out what it's like to lead it in a modern global warfare. Fight up to 128 other players using everything from combat attack helicopters and airborne infantry units to stealth fighters and even nuclear ballistic submarines. As you move your units across the map in real time, often taking hours to reach an objective, with game rounds that can take weeks to complete, you'll forge alliances and coalitions with other players, which are essential if you want to win. But best of all, you can play with the same account on both PC and mobile to never lose sight of your war. Infographics Show viewers get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free when they use the link, but it's only available for 30 days, so click the link, choose a country, and start fighting your way to victory right now. War is brewing in the Middle East. Again, Iran's backing of the various pro-Islamic paramilitary groups has created an unfavorable situation for Israel. However, the US is the primary political and military backer of Israel, so any hostile actions against Israel may pull the US into yet another war in the Middle East. However, the US's political stance has shifted toward maintaining current relations and avoiding overtly hostile practices, as evidenced by the relatively recent military withdrawal from Afghanistan. Therefore, it's hard to say for certain how the situation will progress. But it wasn't always like this. The US and Iran have historically been allies. In the 1950s, the countries were a part of the Central Treaty Organization and also signed a Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement. Iran's oil was freely imported into the US, which was at that point one of the biggest oil importers in the world before the Texas oil revolution in the early 2000s. The mutually friendly political scene got turned on its head in 1979 during the Islamic Revolution. Practically overnight, Iran became an Islamic republic. The new and current government aimed to remove any non-Muslim influences from the Middle East, making Israel and by extension the US its enemies. The political situation has never really improved since then. Iran continued to support various paramilitary units in neighboring countries, which have effectively waged an unending war against Israel politically, ideologically, and even at times physically. While Iran's certainly not the only Muslim country in the Middle East, it is by far one of the most politically active and militant about its goals. However, the country's involvement in the current conflict that has embroiled Israel in the Gaza Strip is primarily through proxies that are closer to Israel's borders, which has been called the Axis of Resistance. Among the most controversial and powerful of these proxies are the following: the Houthis in western Yemen, Bashar al-Assad's regime in southern Syria, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, various Palestinian forces scattered throughout Israel. While these proxies have been fought on various fronts primarily against Israel, their goals so far have pretty much aligned in terms of execution. All of these proxies are heavily militarized, using politics and faith-driven attempts to oust Israel and the US from the Middle East entirely. And their efforts have only ramped up after the beginning of the Israel-Palestinian conflict late last year. Take the Houthis, for example. The revolutionary Shia Islam group overthrew the local Yemeni government in 2014. It quickly allied itself with Iran and became embroiled in one of the costliest UN humanitarian crises ever, causing as many as 24 million people to require aid. Saudi Arabia, one of Iran's largest rivals in the Middle East, has reportedly had to provide military intervention in Yemen to stop the problems from escalating further, but this has resulted only in temporary alleviations of hostilities in the area. The Houthis regime is far removed geographically from the current conflict in Gaza, due to Yemen being separated from the Strip by about 1,000 miles of Saudi Arabia's land. However, since Yemen maintains direct control over the Red Sea, it's been able to endanger Israel's trade and economy while still being left to its devices. In particular, the Houthis regime is being actively armed by Iran with missiles, which it deploys from Yemen to Israel, trying to hit the country's only Red Sea port of Eilat. So far, most strikes have been shot down by Saudi Arabian, Israeli, and US anti-missile weapons and ships in Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea. The few missiles that did make their way into Israel didn't have a significant impact. If one of the strikes wasn't shot down, which wouldn't be out of the realm of possibilities if the Houthis maintained their aggressive stance, the damage could be catastrophic. A missile strike on Eilat could debilitate Israel's ability to trade from the Red Sea, and the surrounding area is one of the most suitable for solar energy production. Israel relies on natural gas reserves and solar energy production for much of its domestic energy, with plans to become completely independent from coal imports for energy production by 2030. Therefore, striking solar production plants could severely hamper the country's ability to function in the 21st century, at least on the level needed to operate independently while surrounded by ideological adversaries. Additionally, due to Yemen's access to the vital Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, the Houthis are in a prime position to influence Israel's incoming and outgoing ship transport in the area. This led to some of the most controversial examples of coastal piracy, including an incident on the 19th of November 2023. One Israel-affiliated cargo ship was intercepted and hijacked by Houthi revolutionaries, with the crew members taken as hostages in Yemen. According to the Houthis, the hostile interactions with ships that have ties with Israel will continue for as long as Israel and Palestine are embroiled in a state of near-perpetual war. The incidents with ships have continued, with the UK, Saudi Arabia, and the US providing battleship support for merchant ships passing through the Red Sea and the Strait. The attacks have slowed international trade passing through the Suez Canal amid fears of piracy and hostage-taking, which can have profound butterfly effects on the global economy. In response, the US and the UK have started targeting Yemen with missiles of their own, trying to take out the Houthi weapons in preemptive strikes before they can be used against civilian targets. On January 11th, the US launched around 100 missiles with the aim of destroying or disrupting 16 Iranian-backed Houthi military sites in the area. The strikes killed 5 people and wounded 6 more, with the Houthis vowing that this response would not deter their mission of removing Israel from the Middle East. A few days later, on the 14th, the US launched another attack on Houthi military setups in an attempt to avoid those missiles being fired on ships and personnel. The US would repeat yet another strike a few days later, on January 17th. This time, the missile response was partly due to a Houthi drone striking a US-owned commercial ship in the Red Sea, which was only slightly damaged, and there were no casualties. The second wave of attacks by the US and the UK started in early February. According to US Central Command, the strikes were made in self-defense against Houthi anti-ship missiles, preparing for launch on ships in the Red Sea. The Biden administration has come under scrutiny for this response against the Houthi militant regime, while Iran has publicly claimed that the Houthis act independently of their commands and directions. They have been steadily supplying the revolutionary regime with the same weapons used to terrorize the Red Sea and disrupt trade. It wouldn't be out of the realm of possibilities if the US Central Command decided to stop fighting the symptom and start going against the source of the problem, Iran itself. But while the Houthis have certainly been a thorn in America's presence in the Middle East, they're far from the only extenuating factor that moves the country toward a full-blown war with Iran. Other Iranian proxy militias are doing their own thing, and they are much closer to Israel. Syria's Assad regime is one of Israel's most militant neighbors, and the countries have been in a de facto war ever since Israel's declaration of independence in 1948. In 1967, Israel occupied the Golan Heights, a plateau in Syria that overlooks Israeli territory, making it a vital geopolitical area between the two warring countries. While the Syrian government looks at the Golan Heights occupation, it's been unable to do anything about the matter due to the currently ongoing Syrian civil war, which has displaced close to 7 million people and resulted in over 600,000 casualties since 2012. The regime currently controls about 2/3 of the Syrian territory, with other parts held by revolutionaries, rebels, and Turkey, Israel, and the US. Around 900 US soldiers are stationed in Syria, having been relocated from the initial occupation site in southern Syria to the country's eastern provinces. However, the decision to leave what can be called a bare-bones military presence points to a lack of direction of the US Central Command on the matter of the Syrian civil war. It also makes it impossible to predict whether the US presence in Syria will have further effects on the Assad regime's actions in the coming months, and even how Iran, who also backs Assad, will intervene in the conflict. Additionally, Assad has also been historically backed by Russia. At the start of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict in 2022, Russia pulled most, if not all, of its military presence away from Syria and put it to work on the Ukrainian front. Meanwhile, the US hasn't needed to meaningfully join the conflict itself due to its ability to supply the EU with oil and natural gas, as well as provide ammunition and weaponry directly to Ukraine. As such, the country still has options remaining to bolster its holdings in the Middle East, while Russia has famously started to exhaust its military hardware. However, that might not matter in the long run, at least politically. While the Syrian conflict has raged for years, it's currently entered into a lull with no side willing to provide additional pressure or extend hostilities. Syria's ability to meaningfully threaten the Golan Heights and Israel itself has been crippled during the first few weeks of the Gaza conflict. On October 12th, Israel bombed two of the country's largest airports in Damascus and Aleppo. By removing the airports from active service, it removed Syria's ability to provide air support to its allies in the Israeli conflict, creating yet another deterrent against retaking the Golan Heights. Even if Assad's regime decides to go on the offensive and invade the heights, there's no telling what would happen to the rest of the country. With several countries maintaining an active presence and occupying the areas of the state, as well as active rebellion concentrations to the country's north, a full-blown move by Assad to the southwest could reignite the war in the rest of the country. But that doesn't mean that Assad can't passively provide assistance to other Muslim proxies in the area. Due to the country's connections to Iran, its territory can be accessed freely by military units to arm the two existing militias in Syria, Liwa Zinbiyun and Liwa Fatemiyun. The former is a Pakistani militia force numbering between a few hundred and around 5,000, depending on which report you read. Meanwhile, the Fatemiyun is made up of Afghan fighters and is estimated to have between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Both militias have been trained and directed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, with the primary aim of assisting the Assad regime in the civil war. However, with the war reaching as close to a temporary stalemate as possible, the two troops have begun moving idly close to the contested Golan Heights, with presumably nothing to do but wait for future developments. These proxies of Iran might be the first active members to take up arms should an official engagement begin on or near the Syrian territory. And it wouldn't take much for Iran to point them to Israel or the US. At the same time, the militias are relatively independent of both Syria and Iran, so their actions may not have much bearing on the politics of the two countries they're using as support. If a push into Golan Heights from the Zinbiyun and Fatemiyun transpires, Iran might claim no responsibility for their actions. On the other hand, Israel would likely be forced to split its efforts from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and move some of its personnel to defend the area against incursion. This could necessitate further commitments from the US Army, either the troops already stationed in Syria, or a renewed invasion to keep the status quo or move the situation in another direction. When the two Iranian-backed militias decide to push into Israel, it might mean that Lebanon follows. Hezbollah is a revolutionary regime in the south of Lebanon founded in 1982 by the Shiite rebels who followed the Iranian Revolution a few years previously. It's one of the movement's most ideologically opposed to Israel. Furthermore, they also hold the most power to influence Israel's economy and geopolitics by virtue of sharing a land border and being close to the country's economic center in Tel Aviv. While the two forces of the Zinbiyun and the Fatemiyun number a few thousand, Hezbollah has had years of Iranian backing and military support to fall back on. According to some reports, it's the biggest non-state military regime in the world, with claims of having close to 100,000 soldiers at its disposal. Even toned-down Western reports suggest an active force of 60,000 people, close to the military power of Lebanon itself. More importantly, Hezbollah controls the southern parts of Lebanon, right on the border with Israel and the Syrian-contested Golan Heights. As such, it has ready access to Israeli lands and already instigated a brief war in 2006, which led to the deaths of around 1,200 civilians on Lebanon's side. In the wake of the Israel-Hamas conflict, Hezbollah publicly supported Hamas, even though Hamas is Sunni Muslim and Hezbollah, alongside other Iranian proxies, is Shia. Since then, the regime has become openly hostile to Israel, with daily military action on the border. As a result, the Israeli government has been forced to evacuate nearly 60,000 people from the towns bordering Lebanon. Additionally, Hezbollah doesn't only have ground troops at its disposal, the regime has proudly proclaimed that it possesses over 150,000 missiles and rockets and is likely ready and willing to use them in its quest to remove Israel from the face of the earth. More troublingly, Lebanon's position north of Israel means that these missiles are perilously within range of Tel Aviv, and perhaps more importantly, Israel's desalination plants and offshore natural gas platforms. Due to Israel's limited access to natural resources, it primarily uses offshore natural gas deposits for energy production. Additionally, the country's arid climate and lack of rivers means it has practically negligible sources of fresh water. Currently, Israel derives close to 80% of its drinking water from only 5 desalination facilities in the country. If Hezbollah were to make true on its promise to support Hamas, a unified aerial missile offensive to the plants could possibly overwhelm Israel's defense systems. If that were to happen, the country could be left with no meaningful source of drinking water, which would rapidly escalate into a humanitarian emergency for its allies. On the energy production front, the offshore platforms are similarly vulnerable. Located in the Mediterranean, the Tamar and Leviathan gas fields, discovered in 2009 and 2010 and operational between 2013 and 2019, revitalized Israel's energy industry. From needing to import over 90% of its energy in the early 2000s, the country has started to plan for complete energy independence by 2030. However, the fact is that the natural gas rigs in the Mediterranean are also vulnerable to attack by Hezbollah. If that were to happen and the Shia militant regime manages to push some of its rockets through the Israeli defense and cut off the supply, the country's energy progress could be set back by 2 decades in an instant. Israel's relatively large natural gas sources also open the door for the country to have a new source of income in terms of selling the gas to its neighbors. It's already exporting natural gas to neighboring Jordan and Egypt, which is a part of the reason Egypt has been hesitant to involve itself in the current conflict. However, there are also plans for the country to build more gas pipelines to supply the resources to the EU, which would open more doors for economic growth and geopolitical maneuvers. Even if Israel manages to defend its energy production facilities, it's still not sufficiently independent to forego port defenses. Namely, the country still imports much of its food and oil, and only a few large ports in the country can satisfy the traffic necessary for that amount of trade. While the southern port of Eilat is largely protected against Hezbollah due to distance, it's effectively blockaded by the previously mentioned Houthi regime in Yemen. That leaves the country's Mediterranean ports to take care of the bulk of the trading. If Hezbollah were to strategically target them as well, the country could stand to lose its entire trading capacity and become blocked off from the rest of the world. In response, the U.S. tightened its leash on Iran, so to speak, placing battleships off the coast of Saudi Arabia and threatening to control the vital Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Additionally, the U.S. Navy has also committed to defending the Israeli claim to the Mediterranean. This has created a tense stalemate between the Iranian-backed proxies north of Israel and the Israeli and U.S. forces in the country. If one side moves, the others would surely follow, but the entire Middle East is too embroiled in decades-long geopolitical drudgery to know for certain which countries would willingly go to war against each other. For example, Azerbaijan is one of Israel's allies and supplies the country with oil, while also being ideologically opposed to Iran. If Iran decides to further support its proxies and escalate current minor alterations on the north of Israel into a new full-blown war, then Azerbaijan could feasibly invade Armenia, which is also supplied and financed by Iran, and then Iran itself in an effort to connect the mainland with its enclave. Additionally, the American Navy is perilously close to Iran's own natural gas and oil fields in the Gulf and is in a position to quickly occupy them and cripple Iran's capacity to influence other countries via energy export. Iran's nuclear projects could also be left open to attack by Israel's technologically superior weaponry. All of this means that Iran might quickly end up in a war state that's impossible to manage should the U.S. strategically apply its full force in the region. In a way, the current state of the Gaza conflict has already benefited Iran. Take, for example, the U.S. proposal to bypass the Suez Canal via a series of ports and rail systems that would move across Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The plan, proposed at the G20 summit in September 2023, was created to reduce the Middle Eastern countries' control of naval trade through the Red Sea. However, it wasn't a self-fulfilling prophecy, even though the first major instances involving the Houthis happened just a few months later. The plan was primarily made to counter China and Russia's plan to influence the countries in the Middle East through northern corridors or open sea trade. But it also allows Israel and Saudi Arabia more freedom from their neighbors in terms of trade connections. Furthermore, it would allow the EU to bypass the Suez and Russia when trading with India. Additionally, Israel and Saudi Arabia, two of the countries that were practically required to cooperate for the U.S. plan to come into effect, were starting to reach diplomatic agreements. Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't recognize Israel as a state, and previous decades of diplomatic relations are coming close to reversing that decision. However, the events in Gaza have put most diplomatic efforts on hold, with countries recalling their diplomats from Israel in response to Israel's bombings in Gaza. According to the BBC, Saudi diplomats still feel that normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel is possible, but the price Israel and the U.S. by extension would have to pay for continuing the process would likely be much higher now that the area is embroiled in conflict. In effect, the start of the conflict has given Iran more time to slow the U.S. incursion as a geopolitical force in the Middle East, effectively stalling or removing most of the progress the Biden administration had made in the past few years. And new progress on the Israel-Gaza front could have many unforeseen effects. One was the recent drone strike on Jordan soil that killed 3 American soldiers and wounded several more. While Iran claimed that the drone didn't come from them, the drone was identified as belonging to one of the proxies, and it's likely Iran was involved in the attack. The U.S. is already poised to strike back, with Biden's recent claims that the attack on American soldiers won't go unnoticed, but that the U.S. Army aims to stabilize the area rather than plunge it into an even bigger war. To that end, the current involvement of the U.S. is to skirt the lines of open warfare and preemptively precision strike the Iranian-backed proxies that aim to destroy Israel before the situation can escalate. However, the rest of the world is still unconvinced that the U.S. is incapable of going long without waging war on someone in some capacity. Biden's opponents in the U.S. have called the current level of response too weak and focused on continuing to demilitarize the area. Then there's also the election looming for America in the coming year. Biden's stance on the U.S. no longer being the global police force hasn't met well with his opponents. For that reason, it's impossible to know whether the administration will double down on its efforts to control America's response to any hostile threats, or if it'll try to end all hostilities with a large preemptive attack straight at the source. Either way, the situation in Israel shows that decades-old wounds are still not healed, and that the world might be embroiled in more political and literal warfare before the Gaza conflict can be put to rest. Thanks again to our sponsor, Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game happening in a modern global warfare. Get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free by using the link. It's only available for 30 days, so don't wait. Choose your country and start fighting your way to victory right now. Now check out what would happen if the USA and Iran went to war, military-army comparison, or watch this instead.